2, 3. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation on effects and impacts of sustainability initiatives on the environmental performance of residential buildings in the Borough of Manhattan, a comparative study and a model for future. I am Kushagra Varma. I am a PhD student in the School of Architecture and Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Carnegie Mellon University. With me, I have Bobuchi Ken-Opurum. She's a PhD candidate in the same program at Carnegie Mellon University. Bobuchi, over to you.
Thank you, Kusha. Next slide, please. So in this session, we will briefly explain how residential buildings consume the largest amounts of energy and water in the United States and how they contribute to energy burden. So we'll also identify the status quo and gaps in research and literature and the methodology we use to address these gaps. And lastly, we'll summarize our research and highlight next steps. Next slide, please. So to start off, I will speak on the need for energy research in respect to the United States. We all live in buildings, but many do not know that buildings remain the largest consumers of energy in the US. This is significant as over 90 trillion BTUs of energy are consumed every year across the four main sectors. Within that, residential buildings account for 22.3% of energy consumption. And residential energy consumption is especially significant as 80% of the US population currently resides in urban areas. With a projected 68% of the world population expected to reside in urban areas by 2050, energy consumption is only expected to grow from here. Next slide, please. So kind of looking at the water side of things, water and wastewater utilities currently account for 35% of the municipal energy budget. Electricity used to process and distribute water is 80% of the operating budget. And the energy used in processing and distributing potable water, coupled with operating wastewater systems, generates about 45 million tons of greenhouse gases annually. Next slide, please. So the large volume of greenhouse gases emitted every year from building-related energy use has significant impact on climate change and global warming. Research has shown that if developed countries such as the US make lifestyle and behavioral changes that range anywhere from energy retrofits to passive designs, energy demand can be reduced by up to 20% short term and up to 50% by 2050. Further, in emerging economies, integrating traditional lifestyles and indigenous practices into architecture could also contribute to energy efficient services. Next slide, please. And this is important because beyond climate change and now, beyond climate change, narrowing now into New York City, the focus of this research, building energy use also has socioeconomic implications. New York City has one of the highest rates of energy burden in the country, and with 3% median energy burden, low-income households are significantly affected by both rising energy prices and inefficient energy use. Next slide, please. Based on 2020 data by ACEEE, the median energy burden for low-income households in New York City is over 3 times more than non-low-income households. And households from lower economic statuses and minority communities are the most at risk to energy burden and energy poverty. As a result, 460,000 New Yorkers are now living in energy poverty. They spend at least 6% of their income on energy costs, and sometimes they spend up to 10%. Next slide, please. So high energy utility costs, poor energy performing buildings also have significant negative socioeconomic and health consequences for low-income families. These images kind of help to put a face to the picture and to kind of build the problem, and to kind of build the picture of the problem. So like when households are unable to afford the energy bills, it's been reported that it may lead to anxiety and depression. In situations where households sacrifice comfort by maybe using space heaters as opposed to like central heating systems, they can flare up asthma symptoms or exacerbate other chronic health conditions that may impact them in the long term. So as a result, New York City and other US cities are currently working through policies and plans to help improve both energy use and water use in buildings. Next slide. So now I'm going to pass it back on to Kushagra to discuss the status quo and the objectives of the research.
Thank you, Bobuchi. So, so we started with, as a starting point for this research, we started looking at the benchmarking laws that New York City has. And we looked at Local Law 84 of 2009 and its expansion, Local Law 133 of 2016. The basic difference between Local Law 84 and Local Law 133, the broad, big difference, is that Local Law 133 requires buildings with private buildings owned by private property owners of floor area more than 25,000 square foot to report their energy and water bills using Energy Star Portfolio Manager to the city, as compared to the previous requirement, which was the minimum floor area had to be 50,000 square foot. So Local Law 133 definitely, like, it includes more number of buildings compared to what it was earlier. As part of this study, we started looking at, or we started this research by looking at New York City's energy and water performance map, followed by reviewing the local laws, Local Law 84 and 133. And then we moved on to review New York City's energy and water use reports. And finally, we reviewed the related published articles that were related to this topic. And we identified some of the gaps that are listed here. There were several gaps, but for this study, for this presentation, we are focusing on the following three gaps. First one is that there is limited research that is conducted to analyze the energy use intensity, water use intensity, and greenhouse gas emission patterns in residential buildings in the borough of Manhattan. There are studies, several studies conducted, but they are at a macro level that focus on the entire city, on all the 5 boroughs. We want to focus on specific boroughs, and this is expected to expand on other locations and other parts of the city. We also feel that further investigation is required to assess the effectiveness of the benchmarking laws, which is not clearly established yet. While looking at the data, the publicly available data, we felt that there were several inconsistencies that limit the effectiveness of the analysis of residential buildings. We are trying to make sure that the data is consistent, and and then we are analyzing the data to find the patterns and trends of energy and water use and greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the big the research question for this presentation, this research study, is how effective are New York City's local laws in lowering the energy and water consumption and in reducing greenhouse gas emissions for or of residential buildings in the borough of Manhattan. One of the questions that arise when we look at the research question and this overall study is that why are we focusing on New York City? So we are focusing on New York City because it is the biggest city in the country. It provides us an opportunity to look at a sample of over around 1 million buildings in future. Hopefully the studies will expand to include all the buildings. That is certainly not the case right now. But so we obviously have these facts. Along with this, we are looking at the data the data that we currently have in our hand includes more than 4,200 buildings. We are looking at 60% of the gross floor area of the entire built building stock of the city. And we also have access to 7 years of data. In addition to all the data that we have that New York City's energy and water disclosures provide us, focusing our study on New York City enables us to perform additional correlational studies with the existing information that's there, like energy cost burden maps, identified areas of high potential for water use, for water source heat pumps, for ground source heat pumps, and the regions that have high wind energy potential or solar energy potential. So we can correlate, we can identify the buildings that are that are underperforming, and then we can maybe correlate and come up with retrofit strategies to improve their overall environmental performance. That's sort of the big idea here. Oh, here you go. So there were some technical glitch in the slides, but it's correct now. So yeah, these are some of the reasons why we are focusing on New York City. Then we moved on to start thinking about what would our research design look like. We started to think about the contextual purpose of our research, the overall research purpose that feed into the research question, which is how effective is New York City's local law, right? What other cities can learn from it? As a research methodology, we're using case study. We also feel that this overall research work falls under post-positivism and intersubjectivism system of inquiry. We could not associate it with a school of thought, however. But so this is the research methodology, the research question, and then we anticipate to find that the benchmarking laws influence the environmental performance of the buildings, and it's good to have environmental benchmarking laws or ordinances for the cities. Moving forward, this slide shows the schematic diagram that we used to understand the process that we would follow to construct validity, to establish chain of evidence. You can see here on the left it says New York City's Mayor's Office of Sustainability, which is the source of the primary data that we are using here, which is energy and water disclosure, information for these years, 2011 till 2017. We wanted to validate. We obviously, we wanted to make sure that the data that we have in our hand is validated before we start analyzing it. So we looked for secondary sources of information where we could find related data that can be used to validate our primary data. So we identified New York City Department of City Planning's website. We went to the website and downloaded some additional publicly available data, Pluto database, which is primary land use tax database that provides us information like borough block lot number, height of the building, age of the building, borough of the building, borough where the building is located. So we used all this information to check the validity or consistency of the data that we received from New York City Mayor's Office website. We also performed a zip code analysis to understand and to make sure that the zip codes that we were analyzing were correct and were in fact associated with the Borough of Manhattan. We eliminated incomplete info fields, blanks, and duplicate fields. And then we also filtered the information specific to residential building types. And for residential building types, we have identified for the purpose of this research, we have identified multifamily housing, residence halls and dormitories, and senior care communities under this category of residential buildings. And these are analyzed here in this research. Since the data was huge, the data consisted of more than 8,000 fields in the Excel sheet. We divided the data into 6 comparison groups for ease of analysis: 7-year, 6-year, 5-year, 4-year, 3-year, and 2-year, and comparison groups, so that we can compare the energy use intensities, water use intensities, and greenhouse gas emissions for the buildings, for these years. And then we were able to draw some inferences out of that. We also compared the EUIs, WUIs, and GHGs using building age and size that you'll see in the presentation. This shows one of the methods that we used for making sure that the zip codes that we had were right. On the right, you see the sheet where the zip codes are that are mentioned here on this sheet are from USPS's website. And then this is on the left, you see a map that is from New York City's district post office, and we compared the two for consistency. And we found several zip codes that were missing or that we could not find on USPS's website. So we first compiled a list of complete zip codes and then performed the analysis to check the consistency of data that we were using. This is just an example to show, the number of duplicate fields that we were able to eliminate from the data. We also eliminated the anomalies that were clearly visible, right? If there were fields that had string values, we could not eliminate them directly, but we visually analyzed the data and got rid of these anomalies. We also observed that the data is not consistent. The published data that's publicly available on New York City Mayor's Office website was not consistent. And one of the examples is this of water use intensity. When we were performing a 7-year comparison, we could not see or we could not find consistent data, and therefore we could only perform a 6-year, 5-year, 5-year, 4-year, 3-year, and 2-year comparison for water use intensities, whereas for energy use intensity and greenhouse gas emissions, we were able to perform analysis for all the 7 years. All right, observations and findings. So these are some of the key observations when we performed the analysis of average site energy use intensities of the buildings. These were the trends that were observed when we performed a 7-year average site EUI comparison. We found that the trends showed an improving trend. You can obviously see EUI, average site EUI decreasing. The next graph shows a 6-year average site EUI comparison, and that's representing 1,775 regularly benchmarked residential buildings, representing 277 million square foot of floor space. You can see the energy trend seemed to increase, but we felt that more analysis was required for definite conclusion. We moved on. We continued to look at the trends. We performed a 5-year analysis. And we saw that there was some variation in the energy use intensity, and then we performed a 4-year comparison where more buildings got added to the sample because more buildings reported their utility bills, from 2014. So we were able to compare the data, and we found that the trends suggest a decrease in average EUI, but we again felt that more analysis was required to draw, the definite conclusions. So we finally, when we looked at the overall average site EUIs, we feel that there is an overall reduction. However, it's not significant, but it's still less compared to when the reporting began. Then we started to look at the water use intensity trends, and we performed the same analysis, for average water use intensities. And we, in the first assessment, that's a 6-year average water use intensity comparison. 205 regularly benchmarked buildings were compared, representing 25 million square foot of floor space. And you can see the trends suggest a reduction in average water use intensities over 7 years. When we analyzed this, for the remaining years, we found that the trends remained consistent throughout. And we can, in our last analysis, where we were able to compare 1,930 regularly benchmarked residential buildings for water use intensity, representing 267 million square foot of floor space. So you can imagine the amount of data that we had and we were analyzing. We found that overall, there is a significant reduction in the water use intensities. We did the same analysis for greenhouse gas emission trends. And again, when we looked at the 7-year, 6-year, 5-year, 4-year, 3-year, and 2-year data, we felt that the trends were consistent. You can see from 2014 to 2017, when we performed a 5-year comparison, this is what the trend was. And when we performed a 4-year comparison with more buildings, with more floor area, the trends were almost comparable to what they were in the 5-year comparison. And it continued till the end. And we can definitely say that overall the greenhouse gas emissions have also seen a decline over the years. We then performed the analysis of median site energy use intensity by floor area and decade built. And you can see this data represents 5,256 residential buildings and 640 million square foot of floor space. We can conclude, or we can say that the buildings that were built between the 1950s and 2009, this major block here, are the buildings that are consuming the most amount of energy. Most of the building built post-war, you can see are the highest, are the most energy intensive buildings. This graph shows the median site water use intensity by floor area and decade built. You can see it represents 3,328 residential buildings and 405 million square foot of floor space. We can see that, again, here we can see that the buildings built in 1970s consumes the most amount of municipally supplied water. Again, further investigation is required because you can see there is this star. And you can observe the star to be here in the energy use intensity comparison as well. This represents or shows that the data was available for less than 5 buildings. So these are median values for less than 5 buildings, and that's why we need more, or we need additional information to have definite conclusive, definite conclusions and to draw final inferences. And then the grayed out areas are where no data was available. So we performed similar analysis for greenhouse gas emissions as well. We compared them for building size and age, and we were able to observe that, again, the buildings that were built in 1970s are contributing the most towards greenhouse gas emissions today. And then the greenhouse gas emissions, it can also be inferred directly just by looking at the graph that greenhouse gas emissions are directly related to the size of the buildings, right? You can see darker blocks on the top where these, as the square footage of the buildings increase. Finally, the conclusions. I would like Bobuchi to go over the conclusions.
Thank you, Kusha, for your really detailed presentation on the methodology and the findings for the research. So without pretty much repeating, I just want to quickly say that the analysis of the energy and water performance data suggests that from 2011-2017, EUI, WI, and GHG emissions from residential buildings decreased considerably. Specifically buildings, the research also kind of shows that specifically buildings built in the 6 decades from 1950 to 2009 are the most energy intensive. The WI data indicates that buildings built in the 1970s are most water intensive, and the GHG analysis suggests or indicates that there is a direct relationship between GHG emissions and building size. Next slide. So continuous improvements in WI and GHG emissions were also observed. However, it's not clear if the benchmarking laws that New York City kind of puts in place is the sole reason behind these improvements. As Kusha mentioned kind of earlier on, going forward, the data will be used to perform correlation statistics to suggest retrofits strategies for buildings that are underperforming at the moment and see how they can improve the energy and water use performance. And lastly, kind of in terms of addressing our research objective, further analysis is required to establish the effectiveness of benchmarking laws and the environmental performance of the buildings. And that's it. And thank you all for listening on this session.
Thank you, Bobuchi. So these are some of the references. And please feel free to send us any emails, any questions that you have, any suggestions that you have. We'll be happy to respond to your questions, and we'll be happy to receive any emails or questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.